Welcome to the Accomplished Brain Podcast, where we share our passion, knowledge, and experience about the brain and health.
That's the first thing. The other things that happen, so we could talk about, so we could give Jeff the mic a little bit. So now we talked about, falling asleep.
Sure. And just a quick note to back on you, Andrew, too, is a lot of studies show how much exercise promote levels of serotonin. And just to make sure that it's kind of understood, it's not that exercise itself actually creates serotonin, but at a molecular level, right, the serotonin has to pass through the blood-brain barrier in order to get to the brain. And so when you exercise, what's normally creating a lot of demand through the brain barrier are amino acids. And because they're bigger molecules and stronger, they'll get through the blood-brain barrier, and that will only leave so much room for serotonin. But when you exercise, you're actually creating a demand for those amino acids to go to the muscle fibers. And so that's getting pulled down, which allows more room for serotonin and things like tryptophan to pass the blood-brain barrier. So exercise is also huge to promote levels of serotonin to help us fall asleep as well.
And that's a great point. That's a really good point.
Yeah. So I think for one, because Andrew's about to get into talking about REM sleep, is we hear about these stages of sleep, and people talk about brain waves and this, that, and the other, and I think Andrew and I are really focused on pathologies and what leads to what. But I think there is some kind of a cool takeaway with these brain waves that they talk about is, if you were to kind of, put the electrodes on our head right now and see kind of what brain activity is going on, is you actually don't really see much noise at all. And that's because with our eyes open, we're hearing things, we're thinking things, is the circuitry is going in all sorts of different directions. But the moment I close my eyes and I start to attempt to sleep, it's not that my brain necessarily slows down, but the action in my brain becomes more unified. So stage one has what are called theta waves, and stage one is like our kind of slow transition stage into getting into a deeper sleep. And what you'll actually see is, if you were to compare the activity or the wave, the rhythm of the brain when you're awake versus this transition stage, is it actually starts to create a rhythm, right? And that's why they call them waves. So I for one think that's interesting. And what you'll see in stage one is the first thing to shut off, and Andrew, this is the occipital lobe is really the first thing to kind of power down and begin to get a rhythm, because occipital lobe is visual processing, right? So you're not taking anything in anymore. So, and by the way, each stage is estimated to last about anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes. Stage two is where you really start to actually get some sleep. It's a deeper level of sleep, but not REM sleep. The rhythm begins to increase, so it's rapid, more rapid than stage one, and your body temperature starts to go down, your heart rate starts to go down. But there's also something really important that happens, which is we start to get sleep spindles, which is a lot of action with neurons. And this is where it's also important. Andrew talked about like the hippocampus before, this is where, the old adage we think is that the brain powers down, which is not true at all. The brain is extremely active. And what's actually happening in this stage with those sleep spindles is they're acting as administrators to help organize our brain. So if I learned something, or I read a book, so on and so forth, it basically helps like administrator kind of organize our thoughts and help store our memory. And that's where these sleep spindles are really important. And those sleep spindles are at their highest level in stage two. Stage three is as we move on to even deeper sleep. are what we call delta waves, and those are actually extremely slow waves, and it is the deepest sleep that we get outside of REM sleep. And then when you move into stage 4, REM sleep, that's where the brain actually becomes even more active than those first 3 stages. But the actual body itself, like our muscles, become the most relaxed and in a lot of cases actually immobilized. So while we go through stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it repeats, as we actually go through the night, those stages actually don't have to all repeat. A lot of times as we get later into the night, we go more so stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back to 2, 3, 4. And the reason why this is important and why we talk about, things like memory loss, right, with lack of sleep, brain fog, so on and so forth, is because if we are losing those last few hours of sleep, right, I'm waking up at 4 a.m. because I'm stressed, or 3 a.m., so on and so forth, you're actually losing the more important part of sleep, because the ratio of REM sleep actually begins to increase relative to the other 2 stages. So while you might sit there and say, well, whatever, I only lost 2 hours of sleep, you're actually losing a greater percentage of REM sleep, which is extremely important for organizing information, for replenishing our nervous system, for replenishing our hormones, so on and so forth. So I think that's really important for people to understand is, there's a lot of talk out there of, do we really need 8 hours of sleep, so on and so forth. And there's actually a bigger argument that it should be more about consistent, right? Whether you're falling asleep at 10 p.m., 8 p.m., or 12 p.m., you just want to find a consistent, and that will help those rhythms. I know it's a bit morbid, but I heard there was a study done back in the 90s that they sleep deprived animals until they died. And they did a study where they took a group of mice and they compared a group of sleep deprived and a group that they gave no food or water to. Both groups died in the same time. And I think that's really important to understand is that group that was sleep deprived had food and water, but they died in the same amount of time as the other group that was allowed to sleep but wasn't given any food. And your brain will not be able to regenerate itself, will not be able to organize itself. So I think it's very important to understand. And they obviously don't do those studies anymore because it's rather brutal and inhumane. But I don't think it's talked enough about how important it is to get that full night of sleep. And lastly, Andrew, before I kind of give the mic back to you, according to Dr. Matthew Walker, who he's written books, he runs a sleep lab study. He actually talks a lot about mental health and the lack of REM or deep sleep. And there's a huge correlation between people who are depressed, people who have attempted and succeeded at committing suicide. There's a huge correlation with those things and lack of sleep. And I think, Andrew mentioned it before with the hippocampus and memory and all that stuff. These things are going hand in hand because people can sit there and say, well, I have anxiety, so I can't go to sleep. But when you don't sleep, you're just ampling that anxiety even more. And we have to remember that if this deep sleep is really important for kind of organizing our brain, replenishing hormones, it's basically our first aid for mental health.
Right.
And not to keep going on about this, but we think about, as a parent and you have a 4-year-old, how important do you think that is for your 4-year-old to get his midday nap? It's vital. And you will do anything to make sure your 4-year-old gets it because otherwise they're irrational. Right. And so for us as adults, it's also important too, like if you're suffering from depression, suffering from anxiety, yes, we can talk about food, we can talk about exercise, and those things are so key, but you got to sleep. And that's what's going to help kind of keep the downward progression or the downward spiral. That's going to keep that at bay and help you actually recover, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Jeff, that was very, very well said. That was excellent. I mean, tremendous amount of value that you were able to add. Tremendous. A lot of good, research Jeff has done, and I thought that was extremely well said.